Thank you so much for joining us and for your participation in this conference. And a special thank you to our hosts. I'd love to, before introducing our panelists, just say, first, I'm Josh Ostroff. I'm the Interim Director of the Transportation for Massachusetts Coalition. We focus on equitable, smart, sustainable investments to improve our mobility network across the state with over 100 coalition members. We've been around for about 11 years. We've got several panelists who I look forward to welcoming. We have with us Chris Porter, principal from Cambridge Systematics. Kim Lesay is Bureau Chief for the Bureau of Policy and Planning for Connecticut Department of Transportation. And my colleague Pete Wilson, Senior Advisor for Policy at Transportation for Massachusetts. This panel is intended to help us have presentations and discussion on what our priorities need to be for sustainable mobility in the years to come. We need to prioritize certain modes of transportation over others if we want to actually green our transportation network, which is the largest contributor towards carbon emissions and climate change. So we're going to talk about what our short-term and long-term transportation investments need to be and how we get there. How do we move towards active and clean public transit? How do we deprioritize dirty, single passenger vehicles? So these are challenging questions, not so much for what's right and what's wrong, but the pragmatics of how we make a decision through a political process. Because every decision is political nowadays. And as we've seen with recent news about perhaps the premature death, but certainly the struggles that the Transportation Climate Initiative, the multi-state compact, is having getting going, people are very concerned about the price of gasoline and what that means for their personal pocketbooks, but that obviously influences what political decisions need to be made by state and regional leaders to move us forward. So I expect we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, which is where I think most of our interesting conversations will be. But to get us started, I'd like Chris Porter to share a presentation. And I think we have someone who will advance slides for you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for being here today.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate the invitation. So yeah, I'm a principal at Cambridge Systematics. I work in the Boston area. Been working here for a couple of decades, but we do work all around the country. So let's see, I guess as my slides are coming up, I will just say that I'm going to share some work that we recently completed at the end of 2020 for the state of Rhode Island for their clean mobility investment working group. This was, I really want to focus on some of the benefits and trade-offs that we can expect from different types of sustainable mobility investments. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background on the project. Again, this was done in late 2020 under the Governor Raimondo for the state of Rhode Island. They had established a mobility innovation working group, and we were part of a team to support that working group. I'm going to talk specifically about the technical analysis work, which was our work. Other members of the team worked with outreach and other aspects of the project. And the primary goal was to inform priorities for new revenue that might be expected through the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. But it was expected that this report would still be useful, even if the TCI program didn't come to fruition, to look at clean transportation priorities in general. Next slide, please. So the mission of the Mobility Innovation Working Group was to really collaboratively develop a strategy addressing the state's mobility needs. And the vision of the group was to look at reducing harmful emissions while increasing safe, reliable, and accessible mobility options that unlock economic opportunity and improve quality of life. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we were really developing the quantitative analysis of benefits. And this is a view of the process that we applied for that, starting off with input from the working group and examples from other states. We developed a list of clean mobility strategies, such as transit, active travel, and electrification that supported the overall goals of the study. We then bundled these into investment portfolios. The goal was to show the benefits of different kind of illustrative portfolios, which a portfolio being, how much money you spend on each type of strategy. And then finally, we analyzed the benefits of those portfolios using a tool that we had developed in support of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which we have been using to support that TCI, and we adapted it for Rhode Island with Rhode Island specific data. Next slide, please. So there's a lot on this slide, but we basically looked at 17 clean transportation strategies, which are shown in the table on the right side. We looked at 5 electrification strategies for light duty vehicles, transit and school buses, trucks, as well as hydrogen trucks. We looked at 7 vehicle travel reduction strategies in the orange, anything from shared ride incentives, micromobility, land use, more compact land use, bicycle and pedestrian investments, finally travel demand to encourage people to drive less. We had 5 transit strategies: bus rapid transit, intercity rail, bus service expansion and efficiency improvements, and then finally electric microtransit. And then we also looked at traffic flow improvements shown in green there, such as signal retiming. And we evaluated those based on 5 benefits: greenhouse gas emissions, particulate matter emissions, or PM 2.5, new non-single occupancy vehicle trips, new job creation, and the value of health benefits. And just a couple things to note: we looked at the benefits per dollar invested. And if you, the non-SOV trips was meant to be a proxy for equitable mobility. There's obviously a lot that goes into equity, so it's hard to capture in a single metric, but this is something we were able to quantify. And as you can see in the table, we'll go into this more with the portfolios, but more pluses means it's more cost effective. So for example, you can see electrification strategies tend to be very effective at reducing emissions, but they obviously don't reduce vehicle trips. On the flip side, strategies that reduce vehicle travel are very effective on improving equitable mobility. Also have good health benefits, especially the physical activity strategies such as bicycle and pedestrian investment. But they tend to not perform so well on emission reductions per dollar spent. Next slide, please. So we created these 3 illustrative portfolios. The first one is mainly electrification, about 75% of revenue going to electrification and 25% going to travel reduction. Portfolio 2 flips it, really emphasis on mobility, with 75% of the investments going toward mobility improvements. And then portfolio 3 is a blended portfolio that is a mix of the different strategies. Next slide, please. And this just breaks down a little bit more how we broke it out. I don't think I mentioned, we estimated under the TCI program that Rhode Island would receive approximately maybe $20 to $25 million a year based on the revenue from the auction of carbon allowances. And so we took that number just as an illustrative starting point, split it up between various investments. And so you can see in the electrification portfolio, it's mostly put into the electrification strategies, with a little bit on, for example, the micromobility included electric bikes and electric microtransit. So we had some technology strategies in the other categories as well. Next slide, please. The mobility was spread much more across the mobility strategies that I talked about. As you can see, we're talking in the order of $1 to $2 million a year per strategy. It's not a huge amount, but presumably, if more revenue were available, we could see the benefits scaling up. Next slide, please. And again, this shows the blended portfolio and just the breakdown, with it really spread across the different categories. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but we did come up with some metrics to show people how much, what does this funding mean in terms of outcomes. For example, the $4.5 million a year available for light duty electrification would mean about 700 new consumers purchasing electric vehicle. It would result in a handful of new transit buses or school buses, for example, if we're put into e-bike ownership subsidies, it'd be about 700 or 800 new e-bikes a year. Bus service, you could get about 60 miles of bus routes with efficiency improvements. So we did that sort of scaling. So this shows kind of the bottom line of the relative cost effectiveness of at least of the strategies that we looked at. You can see, for example, starting with electrification at the bottom of the charts, how they're much more, electrification again is much more effective in terms of greenhouse gas and particulate emission reductions than most other strategies. On the other hand, it has moderate health benefits with the air quality improvements and no benefits to non-SOV trips and sort of modest on the job creation side. Moving up, you can see with vehicle travel reduction, there's a moderate level of emissions benefits, a high level of health benefits, again, mainly due to the physical activity as well as emissions benefits. And the largest benefit for non-SOV trip reduction or trips. Transit and rail provides some degree of benefits, especially on the job side, and the traffic efficiency provides good greenhouse gas emission reductions, but much less on the particulates, health benefits, almost nothing on trip reduction. Traffic efficiency also was good for jobs. The reason being that freight traffic would benefit, which would reduce business costs and improve productivity. Next slide. So when it came down to our three illustrative portfolios, then you can see, as you might expect, the electrification portfolio shows the highest emission reductions for this illustrative $22 million of investment. The mobility portfolio shows the highest reductions our highest increases in non-SOV trips and jobs and health benefits. And of course, portfolio 3, shows a mix. Next slide. So in summary, I mean, this just kind of recaps the points I made about the various strategies. But the overall point here is that, so the study did not recommend one particular portfolio that was really outside of our charge. But as we look at investment decisions, we do need to look at the different benefits metrics. If we're just focusing on climate and greenhouse gas reduction, electrification really is most cost effective. But if we're looking at equitable mobility, we need to look at other strategies that maybe don't have the greatest emission benefits, but have much more benefits in other areas. And in the end, we're probably going to need some sort of balance across that. And in terms of equity, it also really depends on how the strategy and the projects are implemented, which we couldn't look at this high level of analysis. But if you're going to get into electrification, for example, if you electrify trucks and buses, what routes are they running? What neighborhoods are they going through? How does that really affect who's benefiting from the air quality improvements? If you expand bus service or bicycle and pedestrian paths, again, who's benefiting that depends on where you put the investment and how it's designed. So, and the economic side, things like workforce training, providing opportunities for local and minority-owned businesses to really maximize the economic benefits of the investment you are making is important. I know there's some discussion of that later in the conference, and there's also a lot of recommendations in the final report that we don't capture here. Next slide, please. Oops, okay, I think I wasn't there. All right, I just talked to that slide, so let's go to the final slide, please. Great, so the final report is available on the web. You can also, here's my contact information if you want to reach out, if you have any questions about it. Thanks very much, and really looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. A really interesting analytic approach to decision making. I'd like to ask Kim Lesay to share some slides and her thoughts on this topic.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's see if I can do this successfully. And can everyone see my screen?
Great.
Okay. So I wanted to start off with just a real brief overview of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Normally when we have a new act, it has a real catchy phrase that we can make into a word, but we did not have that luck this time around. So we've been referring to this as IIJA or IJA. So forgive me if I just call it the infrastructure bill as we go along. We're very excited about the new bill, well, now law. So it was signed into law on November 15th, and it is a whopping 2,740 pages. So everything that I present here this afternoon is a real brief overview, a very high level look, and I tried to just concentrate on some of the greener initiatives that are in this new law. It does provide us a 5-year surface transportation reauthorization that's going to cover us from fiscal year 2022 to 2026. And there's a lot of ways to slice and dice how much money this means for different programs. I could do a whole presentation just on that alone, and I would not be the best to do it. Our finance folks would be. But all in all, it's $567 billion across the nation. We have been reviewing any draft language that has come out over the years. We've been tracking this very closely here at the department. And we're now in the midst of a section by section, line by line, in-depth review. And for anyone that's familiar with when these new acts come out, they come out and it of course takes a little bit while for implementation and guidance to come with that. So we have been trying to stay ahead of the curve and staying prepared by looking at those drafts as they've been available from the different sections of Congress, and we think that we're really well posed to take some great advantage of some of the new programs that I'm going to go over. We could also see even more opportunities if Build Back Better is passed, so we'll see how that goes in the news. So what's new? So overall, across the board, there's increased funding in just about every single established program. But of note, there's some new programs that focus on carbon reduction and resiliency. Again, there's increases just about across the board in a lot of the discretionary or grant programs that many of us are used to, but there's also some new programs that I'm going to give a really quick overview of. And one thing that I'm excited about is there's some flexibility that's either been put back in or added in as far as use of funds and eligible activities in some of our existing programs. So 2 of the new formula funding programs, there's a new EV charging infrastructure program. I believe that's at about $5 billion across the nation. It will allow for EV infrastructure installation, operation, maintenance. It also looks at data sharing as far as establishing interconnectivity, data collection, looking at access and reliability of the system, and also calls for some increased research and development. A new acronym for everyone to get familiar with is going to be the PROTECT program, and that stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative Efficiency and Cost-Effective Transportation. I think I'm going to stick with PROTECT on that one. Quite the mouthful. And this program is aimed to help states improve their resiliency. We can get an increased federal share if we adopt a formal resiliency plan. It looks at things like evacuation routes and at-risk coastal infrastructure. One of the other new programs is a formula carbon reduction program, and it allows for a handful of things that I've listed here. Anything from funding to come up with a carbon reduction strategy, establishing traffic management control facilities or programs, congestion management technology, some bike ped facilities in there, things like truck stop electrification, vehicle to infrastructure communication when we start to look at cabs, and things like energy efficient lights and signals. Under some of the new grant programs, we've got a new bridge investment program, which is got some hefty, substantial funding behind it at 9.2 billion. Again, this is nationwide. A culvert removal or replacement or restoration grant program, which we're pretty excited about. We have some specific challenges here in Connecticut with the age of our infrastructure. Most of our infrastructure went in around the same time period. And aside from our bridges, we have many corrugated metal culverts that are all coming to the end of their expected life all around the same time. So that's been a particular challenge for the department over the past few years. So we were happy to see that program. What's called a Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation program. Safe Streets and Roads for All. I know that doesn't fall under the greener topic that we're talking about here in this group today, but I'm excited about it as safety is also a big concern here in our state. And then a National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program, and that's more for mega projects. I mentioned that there's some flexibility in funding that we haven't seen before, things that have been added in, or clarifications that have been made. Our NHPP program now will allow us to include measures that increase resiliency. So that's an exciting change. The CMAQ program adds an eligibility for shared micromobility, things like bike share, scooter systems, and adds in purchase of medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles and related charging equipment. So those are some great clarifications to see those things added in. Our Surface Transportation Block Grant program has also been expanded to include EV infrastructure, things like intelligent transportation, again, like that vehicle to grid connection, and intelligent intermodal connections. And it also includes an increased set aside for the Transportation Alternatives Program. And our Highway Safety Improvement Program gives us back some flexibility and funding to look at behavioral and educational aspects of transportation issues when it comes to safety. And it has a new focus on vulnerable road users. A few other things just kind of note out of those over 2,000 pages, there's some added definitions and some modification of terms that I just thought are worthwhile. You know, we're seeing the actual addition of a definition for resilience, for natural infrastructure, and for vulnerable road users. There's some exciting pilot programs that are out, like the Reconnecting Communities program, and quite a few added nationwide studies and support that look like they're going to be coming from Washington, which are often very helpful to DOTs. For example, one of these, another acronym that's quite a mouthful, is creation of a Routes Council. And that stands for Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success. And this is really focused on rural areas and their transportation needs and making sure that they're heard. So just a flash in the pan. This is, again, certainly not all inclusive, but I hope that helps kind of set a framework for some of our discussions of some of the changes, things that we're really excited about to see in this new bipartisan infrastructure bill that has now become law.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's exciting to see these new funding sources coming in the pipeline and just in time as well. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Pete Wilson, to talk a little bit about how we at Transportation for Massachusetts see our decision-making process and what's next for our Commonwealth. Not that the governor and the legislature listen to everything we say, but we like to think they do.
We would
Thank
hope
you,
that
Pete.
they do. Thanks, Josh, and good afternoon, everyone. I do have some slides to share, so okay. just a little bit about T for Mass. My name is Pete Wilson. I'm Senior Advisor for Policy for the Transportation for Massachusetts Coalition. We're a coalition of more than 100 member and partner organizations, which advocates for at the state, federal, and local levels for transportation policies that are innovative, sustainable, and environmentally friendly. We want a transportation system that strengthens our economy and our communities while also being safer, healthier, more affordable, and reliable. We focus probably, I don't know, 80 to 90% of our advocacy on state level policy. But the federal government has played an increasingly important role since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and with the bipartisan infrastructure bill that Kimberly just gave a brief overview for, which is great because I didn't really focus on that so much, so I think it's a good compliment. Just a sort of landscape overview of transportation funding in Massachusetts. So MassDOT combined with the MBTA and our regional transit authorities, which we have 15 regional transit authorities that service mostly outside of greater Boston and rural communities. Annually spend roughly about $7 billion in combined operating capital expenses. And that is a mix of revenue from user fees, like the gas tax and sales tax and federal grants, tolls, public transit fares, and own source revenue. And even with all this investment, decades of federal and state underinvestment in transportation and infrastructure has resulted in a approximately $10 billion maintenance backlog for the MBTA and over 400 structurally deficient bridges statewide. So we spend a lot of money on transportation, and we still have a long way to go to fix our system. So there are a couple of opportunities, one that Kimberly mentioned, but also a state level opportunity that is coming up next year, which is known as the Fair Share Amendment, which would actually put a surtax on incomes over a 4% surtax on income over $1 million. And it could raise between 1.6 and 2.2 billion dollars annually for investments in transportation and education. That is on the ballot next November, and it will probably be a very expensive campaign, both pro and against. These funds, however, even though they're earmarked for education and transportation, there are no particular prescriptive investments, whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on maintenance versus expansion, and there is no funding splits between education and transportation. So that would be for the legislature to decide once that money becomes available. As Kimberly mentioned, Massachusetts is going to approximately receive about $8 billion in federal funding from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. While we don't, at T for Mass, we don't see this as transformative funding, but obviously is a great down payment to help address the needs of the Commonwealth. And the American Rescue Plan Act that was passed in March, Massachusetts is going to see, well, we're seeing roughly $8 billion in that funding, which the split is about 5.4 billion for the state and 3+ billion for cities and towns. It goes directly to cities and towns. That money has to be obligated by December 2024 and spent by December 2026. A lot of the investments in the ARPA funds, you cannot bond against ARPA money, but you can use it as for pay-as-you-go projects. So we at T for Mass have advocated for increased investments in complete streets and the MassDOT shared streets programs that have been successful. And I think it's really important, while the bipartisan infrastructure bill funds start coming down, that the state looks at how to not silo these funds. And if you're doing like a water project for using ARPA funds and you're tearing up roadways, et cetera, how do you coincide your investments in complete streets and redesigning streets to get the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to how to spend future federal dollars? Because I think it's really, really important with the ARA funds that came through in 2009 as part of the Obama stimulus. I think there's been a criticism in the transportation community that we painted a lot of roads and painted a lot of bridges and paved a lot of roads, but we didn't really make any transformative changes. And the Massachusetts legislature that Josh referenced, had the House and the Senate have both passed a bill. We are way behind when it comes to spending the ARPA dollars. The proposed spending is 3.8 billion, which would be I think about 2.5 from ARPA and the rest coming from a state surplus from state revenue funds. The bills have passed both branches of the legislature. However, they have not come to an agreement to send a final version to the governor and recessed for the holidays last Wednesday. To say that Massachusetts is not using the recovery funds in a with alacrity would be the understatement, I think, of the legislative session. So this is just some examples of what the bills spend money on. There's no real investments in transportation or transit, but there is another opportunity to spend some of these dollars in the future. And what we are advocating at T4Mass is when you're looking at all of these investments, you're going to have to figure out ways to address how these investments coincide with future investments in transportation and infrastructure, because it's great to invest in climate resiliency and housing production and economic development, but you still have to focus on mobility. And we have a greenhouse gas emissions account for about 40 from transportation account for about 40% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions, and they disproportionately affect low income communities and communities of color when it comes to public health and mobility. So these are the challenges that we face, and hopefully the legislature can get the governor a bill sooner than later. And just some other things I'd like to mention that we currently support. This isn't our comprehensive list of bills that we're supporting, but it touches on a number of areas that both Chris and Kimberly focused on. So an act to reduce congestion and encourage shared rides. We have the lowest TNC, Uber and Lyft fees in the country. In 2016, we established the first per ride fee in the country, and we have become increasingly well behind. It's only 20 cents per ride, and that money goes back to the Commonwealth Trust Fund, Transportation Fund, cities and towns, and a couple other funds, but we are well behind. The legislature did update these fees last year, but the governor vetoed them earlier this year. E-bikes, we do have e-bikes and they're very popular in Massachusetts. However, they're currently regulated like mopeds or scooters. So there is some hesitancy to really invest in them from a business perspective. And the law needs to be clarified to show that e-bikes are not mopeds and they're not motor scooters, and they can be used like just regular bikes. An act relative to regional ballot initiatives. Under current Massachusetts law, cities and towns are not allowed to levy local taxes to pay for local infrastructure. So this is something that we've been supporting for a long time. This is done in a majority of other states to fund local projects. And it's going to be more and more important as we look at the bipartisan infrastructure dollars coming down directly to cities and towns, that if there are matching requirements, that cities and towns have the ability to raise their own revenue for matching funds. And one thing that hasn't really been mentioned is what employers can do to address both climate and alternative modes of transportation. This bill is the first time the act relative to commuter transit benefits offered by employers. So this would require employers of 20 or more to offer pre-tax transportation benefits, but does not include parking. So they would align with the federal guidelines around pre-tax transit benefits and the caps on a monthly basis. I think it's roughly $255 per month. But this has been done in the state of New Jersey, which is actually their implementation is on hold because of COVID. It got pushed back. but also Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Seattle. And this is actually a benefit both to the employer and the employee. Employees get pre-tax benefits like you would for sort of daycare or healthcare, if you have a health savings account or something like that, to pay for certified or like verified transportation uses such as an MBTA pass, an RTA pass, or some biking expenses. The other side of it on the employer side is that the employers don't pay the taxes on the benefits that employees claim. So they actually get a bit of a reduction in the reporting. It's not a ton, but it's a no cost thing to employers. And I guess the biggest part of this is that when this has been implemented, like it was in San Francisco in 2014, it has been shown to promote mode shift away from single occupancy vehicles and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So if employers view it as a mandate, we view it as something that they can do to contribute, because you need the right incentives in place to get people to change the way that they commute. And a lot more with the work from home these days, employees are looking for more flexibility in how they get to and from the office. Obviously how many days they go in, etc. The MBTA, to its credit, has offered a flex pass. They used to only offer monthly passes or single ride or round trip tickets, and now you can buy packets of, I think it's 10 or 12 rides. So these are things that we need to think more about in a more constructive and innovative way. And with that, that's my presentation on sort of what we're working on. There's a number of other things we're working on, bike and pedestrian access. I don't have the time to go in through all of this, but feel free to contact me, and thanks for having me. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Pete. So this is a pretty broad topic, and we've heard three perspectives. One, obviously a very methodical approach that Cambridge Systematics has developed, and insights on the brand new, that new legislation smell from the federal government. Thank you, Kim. And then Pete shared the way in which we see the world in Massachusetts, where, obviously we're affected by what's happening outside the state, but our concerns are largely within. I see potential for a lot of questions that I could ask, but I want to encourage those of you who are here to offer your questions, and I may direct them to one or more of the panelists. So we see a few things in the coming in the chat. Thank you, Holly. And I'll pick a few questions and direct them. But Kim, asking if you could talk a little bit more by what you mean by more flexibility and how new funding is allocated and used, to the extent that we know that. Would bike ped infrastructure funds or bike scooters be directed to municipalities or allocated statewide? Who would be making those decisions and so forth? And after we do that, I'd like to hear from Kim, if you could just react to the methodology that Chris put forward. But first, let's talk about the bike ped funding flexibility.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Holly. It's a great one. And again, we are still in the middle of going through section by section, and a lot of exactly what does this look like is something that we're trying to figure out starting last week, this week, and next week. The ones that I presented are more flexibility in the fact that those programs themselves have actually been expanded, where we did not see wording previously that would allow those activities to even be eligible under that program. So there's some more flexibility in some of the programs where you're just kind of seeing that message from the administration that this is really the direction that they want to go in, which we're very excited about because we've been heading in that direction here at Conda, and it's exciting now to see some flexibility behind it. Certainly with the grant programs being expanded and new ones being available, there are definitely going to be opportunities for MPOs, and for towns and cities to also go after funding. There's a lot of these programs are both what we call formula funding and grant funding. So I think you're going to see a little bit of both, and there is definitely a push both from the safety side and from the carbon emission side to see more concentration on those non-motorized users, the bikes, the peds, that last mile, that micromobility. So I think to answer your question, it's both. It's not a one or the other. It's not instead of the state. It'll be that we'll see increased funding on both sides. I hope that answers your question.
Kim, thank you, Holly, and thank you, Kim. So Kim, I want just to expand a little bit on what I was thinking about is, transportation planning and funding decisions have really moved forward a lot. We've left behind some concepts like level of service or things that are just purely about the enjoyment of motorists and single occupancy vehicles to looking at more external impacts, specifically, emissions reduction. How much is that filtering into the planning and funding decisions that are made at CONDOT or at MPOs within Connecticut? Is what Chris is talking about, does that have traction, having a data-based approach to making transportation investment decisions? And Chris, if I haven't fairly represented what you're getting at, I'd love for you to chime in too.
So there's a lot there, Josh. I'll try to unpack it. Maybe going backwards a little bit at a time. Please feel free to redirect me if I skip over something. As far as is that kind of ringing true with what we're doing here at CONDOT? Absolutely. There's been a lot of changes in the past couple of years. We have some new leadership here at CONDOT, and we've been going through some great changes. We're definitely looking more and more at that data-driven approach. Chris, your presentation was really interesting, and would love to get a copy of that. I think some of that, we've sensed kind of intuitively from what we see as well, but it's great to always have some numbers behind it to prove it. So we're certainly looking at ways that we can better utilize the data that we have and data collection that we use to make more informed decisions. Kind of a side note on that, COVID has really, I think been a lesson in that, where within 1 month, everyone's travel pattern changed dramatically. And we really had to, react to that quickly. Connecticut was very proud, to continue our bus service. We did have some pullback on our train service because just frankly, folks were not heading into New York City. We saw our roads be absolutely barren for a few months. Our volumes are back. Our peaks are not looking the same that they were. They're not as abrupt. We have kind of more rolling hills versus AM and PM peaks. And now it's going to be really interesting to see what happens post-COVID. We keep asking ourselves kind of the question of what's going to stick, right? What are employers going to do? What are employers going to allow? What choices are people going to make? We've seen a lot of applied psychology going on, right? Are people going to leave jobs if they don't have the flexibility that they had before? People's mindset has really changed with COVID. And so it's really kind of forced us, and it's been a great thing, forced us to look at things in a new light. And so that has really entered into our mindset that this is actually as horrible of a thing as COVID has been. It's been a great opportunity for us to really change our mindset. Our leadership has been, very, very supportive of that. And we've been working on a lot of initiatives to go greener anyway. Similar to Massachusetts, we have some executive orders a few years back that call for us to be leading when it comes to sustainability and looking at resiliency. So a lot of those things are going on in Connecticut that we're really excited about. But I want to make sure I'm covering everything that you wanted to chat about there, Josh. I don't want to take the floor for too long.
No, that was helpful. I mean, for just personally, I wanted to get a sense of how resonant is the modeling that Chris is doing towards the kind of decision making you're speaking to, and I'm pleased to hear that it relates. I know in Massachusetts, when we went into, we started in 2013, we did transportation finance reform legislation that that introduced project selection criteria and tried to move us away from, well, what's a politician's pet project, and which is actually helping to meet our climate and equity and other goals. And that has been a lengthy process, but it has really reformed the way a lot of our decisions are made. Not to everyone's satisfaction, because as I like to say, when the pie is too small, every slice is also too small. But Chris, could you talk a little bit about what the impact and the effect has been of the approach that you've shared with Rhode Island or in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know, what the follow-up has been on Rhode Island. I mean, it was a little bit funny timing, because just as the study was released for Governor Raimondo, she got drafted to a new job down in Washington, and so the leadership changed, and the people that had been leading the study all had kind of gone off to other places, and then so I'm not sure how much honestly there was that turnover and just sort of the odd timing there. And then as you also know, the TCI initiative is really kind of hasn't gotten as much traction as people hoped. So the immediate use for that is not. So I'm not sure. I do know certainly it's an issue that's been of interest in other states as well. And looking, we just did some work in Colorado that was looking at the cost effectiveness of different strategies that might be implemented to meet a greenhouse gas reduction rule that the state is developing. So there's definitely interest in those kind of looking at things quantitatively. And yeah.
Right. Well, I think certainly to the extent we've gotten away from, I mean, it may be too crude to call TCI a carrot and stick approach, but it does have, caps on emissions, and it does, channel funding in the direction we want to go. So I'm wondering, and Pete asked if you want to give this some reflection. To what extent can we take new federal funding streams and deliver the kinds of carbon reduction goals that we hoped to achieve through TCI? And before you answer, I would like to encourage people to put questions in the chat so that we get the benefit of the expertise of our panelists.
Thanks, Josh. I did actually, prior to last week, had a TCI slide in my deck that I since deleted because of the recent, I don't know what you would say, putting it on hold by the governors of Vermont or not Vermont, but Connecticut and Massachusetts. I think the goals of TCI are still definitely something that we should continue to advocate for. I mean, investments in green transportation and alternatives have been shown, to increase the benefits of public health, accessibility, equity in our transportation system. I think the one thing that we were working on, because Massachusetts didn't require legislative authorization to be a part of TCI, was how those dollars were spent. Because in the MOU that Governor Baker signed with Governor Lamont and Governor Raimondo in Washington, D.C., I forget the mayor's name, but in December there was a minimum of 35% of TCI proceeds being invested in underserved and environmental justice communities. And I don't think that's a goal that we should move away from when it comes to looking at how we spend our dollars. I mean, studies have shown, particularly in the last few years, that communities who are disproportionately impacted by particulate matter and adversely impacted by pollution from transportation were hit much harder by COVID than other communities. And if we're really going to look at how we build a system that is greener, more efficient, and more equitable, I think the goals of TCI still apply. We actually are working on a bill that would have required the state to invest a minimum of 70% of the proceeds of TCI in those communities. And it's not just the Boston area. I mean, there's rural communities that would have been applicable, and our gateway cities like Springfield and Lowell, et cetera. I mean, Springfield has the highest asthma rate in the country. So how do we move forward? I think it's up to policymakers to understand, like, we need to look through that lens. And I also think there's things like you said, Josh, there's a carrot and stick approach that we need to look at that have worked in other places. Before COVID, the House of Representatives in Massachusetts passed a bill to increase funding for transportation from a variety of sources, including increasing the gas tax, but also corporate minimums, et cetera, to invest $500 to $600 million annually in transportation. But in addition to that, they also had approved a study on congestion pricing for the greater Boston area. Now, Governor Baker vetoed that section out of the transportation bond bill earlier this year. But when those approaches have been taken in other places like London and Stockholm, et cetera, you do see the mode shift away from single occupancy vehicles and more efficient traffic system, as well as a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Some cities have even torn down highways after implementing congestion pricing. So I think it's a lot, but I do think TCI still applies. It's just you're going to have to get the money from somewhere else, and the carrot and stick approach I find is to be effective. I mean, behavioral economics is a field of study for a reason, right? So I think hopefully the Governor Baker's was a pretty good leader on TCI, and he was really out there, especially for, you know, a Republican in today's current climate, that he will continue that vision through MassDOT's investments in transportation, particularly the flexibility in those federal dollars.
Thank you, Pete. Yes, let's hope that he does bring that zest for TCI to the goals of the program achieved through other means. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things in the chat. Thanks to Gary, John Vollinger, and Rachel Hiskies, if I have your name right, talking about the humble bus, which we in transportation advocacy try to pay a lot of attention to, both in terms of its motive power, how can we get them to be electrified, but how can it better align with changing needs and changing travel patterns. And obviously one big benefit of buses is that they're not reliant on heavy investments in rail infrastructure. But if you, so now with that set up, going back to Kim, do you see ways in which the bus network within the state of Connecticut can be improved to meet the changes we've talked about more recently? More on-demand service, micro-mobility, thinking of it as a service, on-demand, flexible routes, and so forth. Thanks for taking a swing at those 4 pitches that I just threw away.
So yeah, thank you. So Gary, I'm just reading your comment / question there in the chat. Certainly welcome the feedback. I will say that sometimes I just want to make a point on the few occupants. Often there are a few occupants, but we also do feel that those few occupants, likely do not have any other means by which to get to work or to get to school. And so it's important to keep that service going, right? We might say, oh, there's only 1 or 2 riders or 4 riders on that bus. We'd love to see them full, absolutely. But those folks are important as well. I'm not the perfect person to speak to all of our ridership. Our Bureau of Public Transportation is run by Rich Andreski. I will say that him and I have been working very closely together since I took this position. And kind of one of our mantras is to work better together to come up with solutions to issues like this that you bring up. not being able to get to neighboring towns. Certainly hear you loud and clear on that. Our Public Transportation Bureau is working on what they're calling a customer experience action plan. And a large part of that is going to be a very large public outreach to hear from our users and from the community on how we can improve service, what's most important to the people that are utilizing it. The advisory committee on that, I believe, just had a kickoff just last week. But I would say that that's something to be on the lookout for and certainly have a chance, to have a voice, because that's really what we're talking about, is having engaged public outreach. It's another thing that COVID has taught us. We got much better at technology and virtual public informational meetings during COVID. And so that's really allowing us to reach some more people and use technology. I don't think I have to tell anyone here, sometimes state agencies, we really struggle with the technology that's normally available to us. So that's been another good thing that has come out of that. So, as far as innovative and effective approaches, I would say that there are a lot of things perhaps going on at Conda that just haven't made it out to the public yet, and that you don't see those changes yet. But the ideas and the will is certainly there. One of my very first bosses here at the department told me a long time ago, it's a big ship and it takes a long time to turn it around. But I can say that there's a lot of rudders in the water heading, into the same direction. So there is a lot of thought going on there. I wanted to, just touch back on something that Pete had mentioned, where the great ideas that were kind of behind TCI, that those, are things that we shouldn't give up on. I just don't know how many folks here in the room are aware that there is an initiative from the Biden administration, and it's called Justice 40. And that is an initiative that came out of an executive order that's called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And that actually calls on federal agencies like FTA to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of relevant investments to disadvantaged communities. So I think everyone who's been paying attention to what the Biden administration had to say even before they were in office knows that climate change and equity have been right at the top of the list. So I think that with this new bill that's now become law, and with some of these initiatives and executive orders that we see coming out, there's definitely going to be support from above for all of that. And that's another, that's another arena that we're really trying to improve on here at Conda, as far as listening to and better serving those disadvantaged communities, whether they be communities of color, whether they be those that are lower income or those that are rural and have different transportation challenges.
Kim, you've touched on a couple of things that I think are really important. First, the idea of public engagement cannot possibly be emphasized enough. I think that we need to everyone, advocates and planners and people and who are administering services, really need to pay a lot of attention to customer experience, and how can we make the bus the first choice? How do we need to change that? I think that we sometimes inherit systems. We've got 15 regional transit authorities in Massachusetts, which is probably well more than we actually need to efficiently run a bus service that would truly serve the Commonwealth. But the biggest focus needs to be on the customer and the rider and what works best for them. And the other is, yes, this promise of Justice 40 and the urgency of providing investments towards people who have been historically underserved and to this day are not getting the service they want. We've done studies in Massachusetts showing that, the typical Black commute is substantially longer than the typical white commute. And that is not an accident. Those are results of policies that need to be reformed.
Josh,
I want to thank folks for bringing such good comments into the chat, but I'd love to not be the only one asking questions.
Josh,
I'm going to give free Super Bowl tickets to the next person who asked a question.
Josh, can I just add
Okay.
to the bus conversation?
Yes.
I think just to point out some successes that have been that we've had in Massachusetts when it comes to bus. I think it was like last week, maybe 10 days ago. The first center running bus lane in Massachusetts or in New England opened up on Columbus Avenue in Boston, and it's roughly 1.1 miles, but it's a reimagining of the streetscapes and, you know, a center running bus lane with raised platforms and, you know, notifications on when the next bus is coming, et cetera. It's a pretty good step in the right direction. There's been a pilot program for a bus lane on the Tobin Bridge that comes from Chelsea and north of Boston into the city. That's been going on for quite a while, and it's been shown that it has eliminated roughly, I think, 5 to 7 minutes per trip. And those are some of the most traveled bus lines on the system, including during COVID, when some of them were still running at like 80 to 90% of pre-COVID levels. So, and then just, I think last week, the federal government awarded a $15 million raise grant to reimagine and plan the basically reimagining of Blue Hill Ave, which runs through some of the poorer communities in Boston, to potentially build and implement another center running bus lane. So I think the vision is there from the state when it comes to bus, and also from city leaders, particularly in Everett and in Boston and Somerville, where we've seen an increase in bus lanes. However, when it comes to the stick approach, you constantly see on social media and other places the traffic single occupancy vehicles who are sitting in bus lanes. So without the enforcement mechanism, T for Mass supports automated enforcement in bus lanes because it's a proven tool that works, because there are no ramifications for driving in or parking in a bus lane, people are going to continue to do so. So I think it's going to take a while, but I want to say when it comes to bus, we're moving in the right direction.
Chris, I want to just invite you for comments on anything that you've heard in the past few minutes.
Sure. I do want to say with bus systems, we're seeing a lot of work going around the country to really rethink. There's a lot of systems have, routes that have been in place for decades, if almost a century. The MBTA is going through a big process to look at how it can redesign its network to meet current needs. We've seen other agencies do that, Los Angeles, Houston, for example, Denver. And in part and parcel with that is also looking at how it can integrate with mobility services that maybe can provide service in low density areas more efficiently and more cost effectively than a traditional fixed route bus. Because it's true that fixed route buses do not serve a lot of areas very well, and that's simply not. It's just not going to happen. In the lower density areas in particular. So we really need to look at mobility alternatives in those areas. The bus really works best in the high density areas with a lot of people going the same place, and that speaks also to integrating with land use policy to try to encourage more of that development in compact smart growth areas where people have the option to take the bus, to walk, bike, micromobility, and other options to driving.
Kim, this leads me to think of first and last mile service. Are there things happening in Connecticut to incentivize new approaches to getting people home and work when they don't have the good fortune of living on a high frequency transit line?
Right, it's definitely a challenge, right? I think everyone here on the call understands that we have many different communities, stretching all the way from urban to extremely rural. We find that a lot of people, their biggest challenge is, oh, maybe I would take the train, but it's not easy to get. I'm driving my car to the train station, or needing someone to drop me off, or even for bus routes. It's certainly something that we're looking at. We're excited, as I mentioned, with some of the flexibility and funding, to see that some things like scooters, bike share, things like that will now be eligible, where they necessarily haven't been before. So that's definitely something that we're looking at, to improve. That seems to be the key, is that first and last mile for so many people, and keeping it affordable. We've seen some kind of fits and starts in a couple of our cities with scooter usage. It's had some logistical challenges, but I don't think that it's something to give up on. I think we just need to find the right fit for those communities, because obviously it's working in others very well.
Yes, electric scooters with snow tires.
Yes.
Some kind of continuous track device. Let's talk about fare policy, because those are, haven't heard those mentioned, and I see that as a important opportunity, whether it's for equity, just to boost ridership. If you can't make something more expensive, like say gasoline, you can make something more attractive and economical with fares. Just give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to talk about how they see fare policy evolving in the states that you are focused on. Pete, start with you.
Thanks, Josh. I think it's really important. Two things for, I keep going back to incentives, but I think it's really important to understand that some of the policies and what the sort of rhetoric that our leaders, our political leaders have been spouting over the years doesn't align with actually what's happening and how they move forward with what their actual policies are. For instance, when you look at fares for the MBTA and some of our regional transit authorities, they've since 1991 have increased in some cases over 300% on bus, while at the same time the legislature has raised the gas tax 3 cents, which is roughly 14% over that time period. So we're going back roughly 30 years. And when you're trying to incentivize people to take public transit or not a single occupancy vehicle, the policies don't line up really with the rhetoric. Now, in conjunction with that, I think we've also found with COVID that the reliance on fare box revenue as an operating source for public transit is highly problematic when you have a system that, for at least for the MBTA, before COVID was bringing in about $680 million a year in fare box revenue, which was about a third of its overall budget. And that has dropped off dramatically since the beginning of the pandemic. And without federal funds for operating, which was unprecedented in the history of the federal government to give operating funds to public transit agencies, we would have seen dramatic and draconian cuts in service, particularly, and this is particularly important because a lot of folks who are either on bus or subway, not so much the commuter rail, but they rely on that to get around on a daily basis because they don't have access to a vehicle. And this is talking about getting to jobs, education, healthcare appointments, etc. So I think there's an opportunity, and I don't have the answer of what it would look like, but to reshape how either the federal government or the state funds public transit. I mean, you should fund it as a public good and not rely on things that are like potentially volatile sources of revenue. And with, as Kim said, the the people wanting more flexibility in their jobs, and people, maybe working 2 or 3 days from home and not buying that monthly pass, and maybe buying, daily tickets or whatever. There's going to be a reckoning when it comes to how we look at fare box revenue and how we fund the operating system for the MBTA when those federal dollars run out. And it's not great. But I think it's a conversation that needs to be put forward now. And in Massachusetts, particularly in the legislature, there's a penny of the sales tax goes to fund the MBTA. So you have legislators from Western Mass and the Cape and the South Coast where their constituents have been paying for the T for decades. And it's a very difficult conversation because their constituents don't ride the T, at least on a regular basis. So, but we also know that Massachusetts doesn't work without the MBTA. Boston doesn't work without the T. It's an economic engine driver, and people want to be close to transit when they live in a metropolitan area. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I think a lot of people who are smarter than me need to get into a room and sort of try to identify those sources. I know there's federal legislation to give roughly $30 billion a year to transit agencies nationwide for operating, but again, same story. You have rural states and rural representatives who don't want to fund transit at all. So it's a very tough conversation, but it's one that needs to be had especially when you're talking about equity and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the right incentives for changing the way people get around.
Kim, what's going on with fares in Connecticut?
I am not in a great position to talk about that in any sort of detail. That's really handled by our operations folks and our public trans bureau. I can tell everyone again, we were very proud to keep transit service running during COVID. We did take advantage of COVID funds to make sure that happened. And we're restoring our service. I think we're back to probably 80% service on our rail lines. We did recently add a new morning run to our Hartford line on the rail lines. So, as far as fares, whenever there's an increase, there's always quite a bit of pushback from the public, rightfully so. But those are, heavily subsidized by the department. It makes up a very large part of our budget. Again, I can only talk about it in generalities. I'm not the greatest person to speak on that topic. But can certainly, if anybody has any specific questions, I can certainly get some information back to you.
Thank you. So Chris, hoping this is something that is on your radar for pricing and how that affects service levels, ridership and funding, if that's something that you've got.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do think it's an important conversation. I think I think you do have. I think there are a lot of good reasons to look at reducing or eliminating fares at this. Especially in the terms of equity. I think it'll probably has some effect on ridership in terms of encouraging more riders. But there's a large segment of the population where the cost is not the driving factor, where they're really looking at reliability and quality of service. So I think it's more of an equity issue in terms of people who, are paying a lot of money for transportation and can't afford to do that. I do think that does bring up the issue of you do need to have a funding plan in place for how are you going to make up that revenue? Because, if you don't, then, potentially, you don't want to have to cut back service to those same communities where it's essential service, or kind of not being able to keep up the quality of your fleet over time. I do think kind of part and parcel of this is looking at priorities for where you're investing in service, and we've clearly seen that ridership is way down in some areas, and especially in sort of more of the commuter oriented services, and it's only down a little bit in areas that you're serving sort of essential workers, low wage, low income populations. And, so maybe taking a hard look at where you're prioritizing your services, looking really prioritizing where it's needed most by people, and then looking at if you can reduce or eliminate fares to those areas, and as opposed to trying to spread service everywhere. But yeah, I agree, it's an important conversation and not one with a lot of really easy answers.
No, but it's encouraging, just adding my 2 cents here. It used to be 5 cents, but never mind. That I think that we have gotten away, or in many cases gotten away from thinking of how is every transit line going to pay for itself? And what is the return on investment? And what is the cost per rider? Or even using the term subsidy to refer to public transit. Seldom do we talk about the subsidies provided to people who want to travel in air-conditioned comfort in their own vehicle, imposing costs on the communities that they may drive through. So that's, I think, helpful that we're getting away from that, but we still have a long way to go, because in the broader budget conversation, I think, as others have observed, politically, legislators who don't represent communities that have a lot of transit needs don't pay attention to these debates, or they only want to secure funding for roads and bridges in their districts. Or maybe there's not a strong political constituency among public transit riders. Maybe part of that is to help mobilize the institutions, the businesses, the organizations that really depend on public transit in order to get their customers and their workforce in. So just building a broader base of support. I know this is not a political rally, so I don't mean to be on a soapbox here, but I am very grateful to those of you who've attended this. That we had about 50 people at our peak. Nobody has won the Super Bowl tickets. Well, actually, I have, because I asked the most questions, but I don't think I can use them this year. I'm very grateful to our panelists. So Pete and Kim and Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge with this. I think that the coming year, with new funding streams and sort of a shakeout of TCI, or the aftermath of TCI, and looking at alternatives, has to move us forward towards greener, smarter transportation policy decisions. And I'm optimistic that with the kinds of regional collaboration and knowledge sharing that this great conference has brought together, and that TCI's umbrella helped provide, that we can learn more from each other and probably end up with a stronger transportation network with better choices and options available for the health of the planet and all of us who depend on it. Thank you so much for being here. You're about to get a short break before the next session. I'd like to thank Jennifer for her help, and Josh for his in administering the chat and keeping all of this going. The Center for Latino Progress has been a wonderful host. Thank you all so much for being here today, and enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of your day.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a transport rifle ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University, studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work for us if interested. We hope to see you around.